July 21st, 1973, a quiet street in Lillehammer, Norway. The sun had just set behind the hills, and the air still held the warmth of a long northern evening. A man walked home with his pregnant wife, holding a bag of groceries and smiling faintly at her. Behind them, two strangers watched from a parked car. Silent, tense, waiting for a signal. When it came, it was just one whispered word. Moments later, the silence of Lillehammer broke with the sound of gunfire. The man fell to the ground, dead before he hit the pavement. And in that instant, Mossad, one of the world's most feared and secretive intelligence agencies, realized it had just made the most catastrophic mistake in its history. The man they'd killed wasn't a terrorist. He was a waiter. Before we dive into this story, tell me, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? If you love uncovering true spy operations, especially the ones that went horribly wrong, make sure to subscribe, because the secrets we're about to reveal were buried deep for decades. Welcome to Spy Shadows. It began not in Norway, but in Germany, a year earlier. Munich, September 1972. The world watched in horror as armed members of a group calling itself Black September stormed the Olympic Village, taking 11 Israeli athletes hostage. For hours, television cameras broadcasted a global nightmare: negotiators, police, panic, and confusion. By the end of the day, all 11 athletes were dead. The massacre shook Israel to its core. It wasn't just an attack. It was humiliation on the world stage. Inside Tel Aviv, the mood turned from grief to fury. The government, led by Prime Minister Golda Meir, authorized a covert directive that would change Mossad forever: find and eliminate every person involved in Munich. The order was clear, cold, and absolute. That operation would later be known as Wrath of God. It was not a single mission. It was a campaign. Dozens of agents scattered across Europe with false passports, safe houses, and coded orders. Their task was to track down members of the Palestinian network believed responsible. To run such a vast manhunt, Mossad relied on one of its most secretive units, Caesarea, a division trained in deep cover assassinations. Its operatives had already carried out several successful missions, swift, silent, and clean. Each hit left behind no trace except a body and confusion. But success, in the world of espionage, breeds something dangerous: overconfidence. For months after Munich, the Wrath of God operation claimed targets across Rome, Paris, Athens, and Nicosia. Some of those killed were indeed connected to the attack. Others were suspected but never confirmed. Inside Mossad's ranks, moral lines began to blur. Agents were told not to question the intelligence, just to execute the mission. By mid-1973, the list of names was growing shorter. The agency believed one man still eluded them: Ali Hassan Salameh, a charismatic and elusive figure, often referred to as the Red Prince. He was believed to be the mastermind behind the Munich operation, and Mossad considered him their most wanted target. Salameh was careful, constantly changing locations, surrounded by bodyguards, and well connected across Europe and the Middle East. Intelligence on his whereabouts was fragmented, unreliable, and often conflicting. Then came a new lead, from a supposed informant in Lebanon. Salameh, the informant claimed, was hiding in a small, quiet Norwegian town called Lillehammer under a false identity. For Mossad, it sounded strange, but possible. The agency had learned that the unexpected often hid the truth. And so, a small team from the Caesarea unit was sent to Norway. Their mission: verify, confirm, and if the opportunity arose, eliminate. They landed quietly in Oslo and made their way to Lillehammer, posing as tourists. Among them were seasoned operatives, skilled in surveillance and tradecraft, but also a few newer recruits. Their orders were to find the man believed to be Salameh, confirm his identity, and prepare for the operation. The lead pointed to a man named Ahmed Bouchiki, a Moroccan-born waiter working at a local cinema cafe. To the Mossad agents, he seemed to fit the description. Olive complexion, short beard, dark hair. But there was a problem. None of them had ever seen Salameh in person. They were working only from photographs and word-of-mouth intelligence. Still, the confirmation came down the line. This is your target. For several days, they followed Bouchiki through the streets of Lillehammer. They noted his routines, walking his wife home after work, stopping at a local store, greeting neighbors. The simplicity of his life didn't raise alarm. The agents convinced themselves that this ordinariness was precisely what a high-value target would use as cover. On July 21, 1973, Mossad's director gave the go-ahead. The operation would be carried out that night. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the team split into vehicles and took positions. 2 agents trailed Bouchiki and his wife as they walked home. When the couple stopped near their apartment, a car pulled up, its headlights flashing once. Inside, the shooters raised their weapons. 3 muffled shots echoed through the street. Ahmed Bouchiki fell to the ground, bleeding in front of his wife. Within seconds, the team vanished into the darkness. They left behind a dead man, a traumatized woman, and the first cracks in the myth of Mossad's infallibility. The agents regrouped in Oslo, confident that the mission was a success. Reports were filed and congratulations exchanged. But only hours later, the truth began to surface. Norwegian police identified the victim, not as a known terrorist, but as a Moroccan waiter with no political ties. By the next morning, the story hit local headlines. An innocent man had been killed on Norwegian soil by what appeared to be a professional hit squad. The operation that began as vengeance for Munich had become a diplomatic disaster. The morning after the assassination, the town of Lillehammer awoke to unease. Police cordoned off the scene. Locals whispered about the shooting, something unheard of in their quiet community. A young man, Moroccan-born, had been gunned down beside his wife. There were no signs of robbery, no motive, no suspects. In the still air of that Norwegian summer morning, investigators found only one clue: the precision. Whoever had done this knew what they were doing. The shots were clean, the escape was fast, and there was no trace of panic. This wasn't the work of local criminals. This was something else. Inside Mossad headquarters in Tel Aviv, the atmosphere was the opposite: cold and clinical. The operations handler received a coded message confirming successful elimination. To them, the mission was closed. Reports were filed. Another name was checked off the Wrath of God list. No one questioned it. No one asked if the man had truly been Ali Hassan Salameh. For Mossad, the manhunt had become a rhythm. Locate, confirm, execute, disappear. There was little time for reflection. Each mission carried the same justification: the memory of Munich. But far away from Tel Aviv, in Norway, the operation was already unraveling. In Lillehammer, the police began piecing together witness statements. Locals described strange foreign tourists, too observant, too cautious, some renting cars under false names. One detail stood out. Several of these people had been seen repeatedly near Bouchiki's workplace and home. Within 24 hours, Norwegian intelligence began coordinating with the local police. They suspected the presence of a foreign intelligence cell operating on their soil, something that, if proven, would be a severe breach of sovereignty. At first, the agents involved in the killing didn't panic. Mossad's cover stories were usually airtight. Each operative had multiple aliases, foreign passports, and escape routes. But Lillehammer wasn't Paris or Rome. It was a small town. And small towns remember faces. When the agents checked out of their hotels, they were noticed. When they used local taxis, the drivers remembered their accents. When they made phone calls from public booths, locals took note. In a country where foreign visitors were few, their presence stood out like a flame in the dark. On July 22nd, just one day after the assassination, Norwegian police made their first arrest. A woman named Sylvia Raphael, a South African-born Mossad operative traveling under a false Canadian identity, was stopped while trying to leave the country. She had been seen near the murder scene and had rented a car under a suspicious name. Under interrogation, her story began to crumble. Norwegian authorities, experienced in counterintelligence through NATO, recognized inconsistencies, false phone numbers, forged addresses, nervous pauses. By the third day, they had more suspects. A couple traveling with Raphael, another man caught making coded calls to Oslo, and 2 others who had tried to leave the country suddenly. Within a week, 6 Mossad operatives were in Norwegian custody. It was one of the most devastating breaches in Mossad's history. An entire cell exposed, names discovered, and operations compromised. In Tel Aviv, panic replaced confidence. The news hit the agency like an earthquake. The operation, which was supposed to be routine, had collapsed under the weight of a single mistake. And now, their agents were being paraded in European headlines as assassins. Senior officials scrambled to contain the situation. Diplomatic pressure was quietly applied through back channels, but Norway refused to be intimidated. The government was furious. A friendly state's sovereignty had been violated, and an innocent man had been killed in front of his wife. Israel officially denied involvement. Publicly, they expressed regret for the incident while distancing themselves from the accused. But behind the scenes, Mossad's top brass debated how to manage the fallout. If these agents talked, decades of covert operations could be exposed. The arrested agents were separated and questioned for days. Norwegian police were patient, calm, methodical, and relentless. They didn't need confessions. They needed inconsistencies. And they found plenty. Each suspect had a slightly different backstory, but similar forged details. Same type of passports, same embassy connections. Soon, investigators uncovered that multiple of them had recently entered Norway through neighboring countries using diplomatic routes, something ordinary tourists would not have access to. As interrogations continued, the pieces began to align. It became clear that the group had been operating under an organized intelligence framework. The authorities didn't yet know it was Mossad, but they knew it was professional. Then came the discovery that sealed it: hidden communication codes and contact notes written in Hebrew. The facade was gone. The Norwegian government moved quickly. They expelled several Israeli diplomats suspected of coordinating with the assassins. The scandal dominated international headlines. Foreign agents kill innocent man in Lillehammer. European governments, already wary of Mossad's aggressive tactics on their soil, began quietly reviewing their own security cooperation with Israel. The fallout spread far beyond Norway. For Israel, the diplomatic damage was immense. Years of covert alliances and silent understandings were jeopardized overnight. Mossad, once considered nearly untouchable, had been publicly humiliated, not by a rival intelligence service, but by local police. Inside the agency, shock turned into introspection. Senior figures questioned how such a fundamental intelligence failure could have occurred. The root cause was soon identified: flawed verification. The agents on the ground had trusted a single informant, S claim, without secondaries, confirmation, or photographic evidence. The same haste that had fueled Operation Wrath of God S' earlier successes had now destroyed its credibility. A policy built on vengeance had blinded its operatives to the risk of human error. Mossad quietly withdrew several agents from European missions. Safe houses were shut down. The Caesarea unit, the elite assassination arm, was temporarily dismantled and reorganized. For the agents still imprisoned in Norway, Mossad made quiet efforts to negotiate. Over months, a series of legal maneuvers and diplomatic back and forths led to eventual releases. But the stain on the agency's reputation could not be erased. Meanwhile, the story of Ahmed Bouchiki began to spread across Europe. He was not a militant, not a spy, not a political actor. He was a 30-year-old waiter, recently married, expecting a child, and working an ordinary job in a peaceful town. His wife's testimony to police and media was heart-wrenching, describing how her husband was shot beside her, how the men drove away without a word, and how she had no idea why anyone would want him dead. In a single night, an innocent life had been mistaken for that of one of the world's most wanted men. And because of that mistake, one of the world's most powerful intelligence services was now under public trial. For years, Mossad's operations across Europe had thrived on one unspoken rule: plausible deniability. Governments looked the other way, quietly tolerating assassinations as part of Cold War politics. But the Lillehammer incident changed everything. After Norway's investigation, several European states demanded that Mossad cease all unauthorized activities within their borders. Intelligence sharing agreements were re-evaluated. Even the United States expressed quiet concern over Israel's increasingly reckless, covert actions. The myth of Mossad's flawless efficiency was gone. The agency that had once moved unseen was now being discussed in public, not as a symbol of skill, but as a reminder of what happens when intelligence turns into vengeance. By the end of 1973, Norway had convicted 5 of the captured agents. They served reduced sentences but were banned permanently from re-entering the country. Israel officially refused to confirm their affiliation, but quietly welcomed them home years later. Behind the scenes, Mossad rebuilt its network. More cautious this time, more secretive. But for many inside the agency, the lesson of Lillehammer remained a permanent scar: that even the most precise machine can collapse from a single false assumption. The mistake in Lillehammer didn't just expose Mossad, it exposed a universal truth of espionage. The deeper you operate in the shadows, the more devastating a single ray of light can be. The streets of Lillehammer had returned to quiet, but the reverberations of one summer evening refused to fade. For the town, the scene of the shooting had become a grim reminder that no place, no matter how peaceful, was immune from the far-reaching ambitions of global intelligence. Ahmed Bouchiki's death was more than a personal tragedy. It was a crisis that would ripple across Europe, Israel, and even the Middle East, shaking the credibility of one of the world's most feared intelligence agencies. Immediately after the assassination, Norwegian authorities launched a comprehensive investigation. Witnesses described foreign operatives following Bouchiki. Surveillance photos and taxi logs painted a clear picture. This was not a random act of violence, but the work of a trained team. As police pieced together the operation, one conclusion became inescapable. They were dealing with an organized foreign intelligence operation operating openly in Norway. This realization alarmed government officials. In a country that had long prided itself on neutrality, the idea of covert assassins operating on its soil was unacceptable. Norwegian officials demanded answers. Diplomats were summoned, inquiries were made, and foreign embassies received quiet warnings. Your agents are under scrutiny. Any further illegal action will not be tolerated. News of Bouchiki's death quickly spread beyond Norway. International media picked up the story. A man mistaken for a wanted terrorist was executed in front of his wife by unknown foreign agents. The headlines were damning: assassination on Norwegian soil, mistaken target killed by foreign operatives, Mossad agents arrested. Public outrage followed. Human rights groups condemned the operation. Governments across Europe expressed concern over the violation of sovereignty. This was not the quiet, hidden strike Mossad had planned. Instead, it became a symbol of the dangers inherent in unchecked intelligence operations. Inside Tel Aviv, the reaction was urgent and tense. Senior officials realized that the operation had gone catastrophically wrong. The intended target, Ali Hassan Salameh, was alive, thousands of miles away. Instead, an innocent man had been killed. Diplomatic cables were sent. Legal advisors and embassy officials were tasked with mitigating the fallout. Mossad operatives in Europe were recalled or instructed to stay low. Safe houses were abandoned. Entire networks, painstakingly built over months, were at risk of exposure. This was more than a mistake. It was a lesson in the perils of relying on single-source intelligence and the dangers of allowing vengeance to override verification. The international intelligence community observed the Lillehammer disaster with a mixture of curiosity and caution. Mossad's reputation for precision, efficiency, and invulnerability had long been feared. Now, Europe saw that even Israel's elite could falter. Some agencies quietly used the incident as a case study, analyzing how errors could propagate in operations that were assumed infallible. They observed the fallout in Norway, noting the rapid coordination between local police, intelligence agencies, and the press. For Mossad, the lesson was stark. Flawless execution was no guarantee against human error. Norway's response was swift and firm. Several Mossad operatives were arrested and eventually tried for the murder of Bouchiki. Diplomatic expulsions were enacted. Israeli officials faced formal protests. European allies began scrutinizing intelligence operations on their soil, imposing stricter controls and monitoring. Israel, which had justified its secret operations abroad as part of a necessary counter-terrorism effort, faced international criticism. The narrative shifted from Mossad avenging Munich to a foreign agency violating European sovereignty and killing an innocent man. Inside Mossad, there was acknowledgement that secrecy could not prevent accountability. The Lillehammer incident had publicly exposed their network and methods, a rarity in intelligence history. Within Mossad, the Lillehammer disaster triggered an intense internal review. Investigators asked, why was Bouchiki identified as Salameh? Why were no secondary confirmations sought? How could multiple operatives misidentify a man in broad daylight? The answers revealed systemic issues. Intelligence was rushed in response to the emotional weight of Munich. Field operatives relied on a single informant without corroboration. Protocols for verification had been ignored in favor of expediency. The agency realized that even elite operatives could misinterpret signals, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Outside Norway, media coverage focused on human error and morality rather than strategy. Editorials criticized Mossad for prioritizing vengeance over accuracy. Human rights organizations emphasized the innocence of Bouchiki, highlighting the tragedy of an ordinary man caught in geopolitical crossfire. In Israel, the incident caused unease. For the public, Mossad's successes had always been invisible, stories of silent victories against adversaries. Now, failure had entered the open. Questions arose about accountability and oversight, issues that had rarely been part of the narrative surrounding covert operations. For the Mossad operatives themselves, the fallout was immediate and personal. Some were arrested by Norwegian authorities. Others were forced into hiding. The safe houses they relied on were abandoned. Long-term surveillance plans were disrupted. Those who remained in Europe faced increased scrutiny. Their identities, once secure behind forged documents and careful planning, were now compromised. Every action carried the risk of exposure. It became evident that a single misstep could not only end a mission, but also unravel an entire intelligence network. The Lillehammer disaster had consequences beyond Israel. European intelligence agencies strengthened surveillance of foreign operatives. Protocols for covert activity within allied nations were reassessed. Diplomacy between Israel and European nations faced tension, particularly in Scandinavia, where the breach of sovereignty was a serious offense. Mossad's operational doctrine, previously based on secrecy and precision, had to be re-evaluated. The agency recognized that moral and procedural safeguards were necessary, even in the pursuit of national security objectives. At its core, the Lillehammer disaster was a story about human error, compounded by emotion, haste, and assumption. Even the most experienced and secretive agencies are fallible. Even the most methodical operations are vulnerable when verification is neglected. Ahmed Bouchiki's death was a tragedy. The failure to properly confirm his identity transformed a mission into a diplomatic crisis. For Mossad, it was a moment of reckoning. The fine line between vengeance and justice, between secrecy and accountability, had been crossed, and the consequences were irreversible. By the end of 1973, Mossad had learned a painful lesson. Operations in Europe were temporarily scaled back. Field protocols were revised. Trust in intelligence sources became a central concern. Yet the shadow of Lillehammer remained. The story of a single night, one man misidentified, and the resulting diplomatic storm became a permanent mark on Mossad's history. Even the most disciplined intelligence agency, it seemed, could not fully escape the weight of human error. The aftermath of the Lillehammer disaster stretched far beyond Norway. What began as a single misidentified target had erupted into a diplomatic, operational, and moral crisis for one of the most secretive intelligence agencies in the world. Mossad had prided itself on precision. Its agents were trained to move unseen, strike decisively, and vanish without leaving a trace. Yet, in Lillehammer, all of that had failed. The agency that had once operated in near-perfect secrecy was suddenly exposed on an international stage. Norwegian authorities moved swiftly to ensure accountability. Several of the operatives involved in the assassination were arrested and tried. Legal proceedings revealed the operational methods of Mossad, how agents used false passports, rented safe houses, and coordinated via coded communications. While some sentences were eventually reduced or served in Israel, the trials themselves were a public humiliation. Mossad, for the first time in Europe, had its operations dissected in open court. This not only embarrassed Israel diplomatically, but also forced the agency to reevaluate how it conducted missions in allied nations. The political ramifications were immediate. Norway expressed strong disapproval of Israel's actions on its soil. Several European governments quietly re-examined their agreements with Israeli intelligence. Even nations considered allies began questioning the reach of covert operations. The incident highlighted a critical problem. When intelligence agencies act outside of sovereign boundaries, mistakes have consequences not just for the operatives, but for international relations. Israel, meanwhile, faced the difficult task of defending its national security agenda while acknowledging a grievous error. Officially, the nation issued statements of regret, but the international community was not satisfied. Public opinion shifted, and trust in covert operations became more fragile. Inside Mossad, the Lillehammer disaster catalyzed reflection and reform. Operations in Europe were temporarily suspended. Surveillance protocols were tightened. Verification standards for high-value targets became more stringent. The agency also revised its training programs. Operatives were reminded that even in vengeance-driven missions, confirmation and patience were as vital as skill and courage. Mossad's leadership recognized that emotion, particularly grief or anger, could compromise judgment, and that human error, even in the most disciplined teams, was inevitable. The disaster became a case study within the agency for years to come. A lesson that no target is so important that procedures can be skipped, no vengeance so urgent that verification can be ignored. While much of the attention focused on the intelligence and diplomatic consequences, the personal tragedy of Ahmed Bouchiki and his family cannot be overstated. Bouchiki was a man with no ties to terrorism or political violence. He had been living an ordinary life when his fate collided with a global intelligence campaign. His death not only devastated his family, but also served as a sobering reminder that espionage is not abstract. Its errors have real-world victims. Even decades later, Bouchiki's story remains emblematic of the dangers of secret operations carried out without accountability. It illustrates a profound truth. Intelligence work, for all its sophistication, is always subject to human imperfection. The Lillehammer disaster resonated far beyond Israel and Norway. Intelligence agencies worldwide took note. Verification is crucial. Mistaken identity can escalate into international crises. Oversight matters. Even elite teams require supervision and cross-checks. Diplomatic consequences are unavoidable. Actions on foreign soil carry political and legal ramifications. Human error is inevitable. Procedures, training, and protocols can mitigate mistakes, but never eliminate risk entirely. For Mossad, the lesson was seared into institutional memory. In the years that followed, European operations became more cautious, intelligence sharing more nuanced, and risk management more rigorous. The Lillehammer disaster exposed vulnerabilities in what was often considered a flawless intelligence apparatus. Internationally, Mossad's aura of invincibility was punctured, yet paradoxically, the agency's long-term reputation endured. The lesson was twofold. Public exposure of failure does not necessarily erase decades of operational success, but it does serve as a reminder that even the most competent organizations are vulnerable to human error and flawed intelligence. Mossad adapted. It rebuilt its European networks, integrated stricter verification protocols, and continued its covert operations, but the shadow of Lillehammer remained. The story of an innocent man, shot on a quiet street in Norway, became a cautionary tale for intelligence agencies worldwide. Even the best-laid plans can go catastrophically wrong. The Lillehammer disaster also invites reflection on the moral dimension of intelligence work. The Wrath of God campaign was motivated by grief, anger, and a desire for justice. But when those emotions override rational procedure, tragedy can result. Mossad had sought to avenge the Munich massacre, a legitimate national trauma. Yet in Lillehammer, the line between justice and recklessness was crossed. A single night, a single misidentified target, and a carefully orchestrated operation became a global embarrassment. It serves as a reminder that in espionage, as in life, precision, patience, and verification are essential, not just skill or courage. The Lillehammer disaster remains one of Mossad's most famous failures, a story of ambition, error, and the tragic consequences of misidentification. It demonstrates that intelligence work is never infallible, no matter how secretive or sophisticated the agency. For Mossad, the incident was painful but instructive, a lesson in humility, oversight, and the human cost of covert operations. For the world, it remains a stark reminder that the shadows of espionage are populated not only by victories and secrets, but also by errors that reverberate far beyond their immediate circumstances. If you thought this mission was a disaster, wait until you hear about the next covert operation that changed intelligence history forever. Subscribe to Spy Shadows, where secrets never sleep and the shadows always tell the truth.